Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We are now officially a homeless church, and so you'll see our videos being shot potentially in different places from time to time. We did have to sell our building as we are waiting out the end of the pandemic. At this point in history, we now have 7.5 million Americans infected, and more than 200,000 are now deceased, and our president, at least at this recording, is himself hospitalized. And so we ask you to continue to support us and bear with us. We live in hope that we will again be reformed in our own space sometime in the spring of 2021, but this could be a traveling microphone for a little while. If you're willing to send support to us, we'll show our website where you can click on the PayPal button, which is easiest for our international listeners, of course, to donate that way. If you would like to mail us a check at Post Office Box 10,062, Springfield, Missouri 65808. That's the most efficient, and PayPal doesn't get to keep any of the money. So if you'll support us, please do. Otherwise, tell your friends. Join us for our online services.
This is The Colony by Vera Sola. I found myself a new world, sailed around its reef. I wrought myself a country, and I crowned myself its king. And I made myself religion, carved Christ in ivory, and I deemed an airtight Sunday to justify myself all the bleeding. I carved myself a nation, and I've sharpened its waterways. I crack the dirt for smoking out these rhymes of energy. I gouge myself a pipeline, and I dig myself a mine, and I take myself a forest to sap the growing up of your shrine. I've halted ghosts from dancing, swept the prayers from the last ones left. I kept the drums from breathing. It's I that warmed the blanket's web. I feed on living bodies and take the land from them. I take the condor's wing to stanch their living, and take them from the land to stanch their living, to stanch their living.
Please pray with me now. We acknowledge our long history of both dominating and extinguishing the cultures of those around us. We especially confess, on the part of our European ancestors, the intentional genocide of Native Americans. Help us, we pray, to have the courage to be honest about our history so that our future may be more virtuous.
This is Land of the Free by The Killers. this windblown smile from across my face. It's just the old man and me, washing his truck at the Sinclair station in the land of the free. And his mother, Adeline's family, came on a ship, cut coal and planted a seed down in them drift mines of Pennsylvania in the land of the free. In the land of the free. There's room for you and for me in the land of the free. When I go out in my car, I don't think twice. But if you're the wrong color skin, you grow up looking over both your shoulders in the land of the free. And how many killings must one man watch in his home till he sees the price on the tag? 8 measured minutes and 46 seconds. Another boy in the bag. Another stain on the flag. In the land of the free. Move on, there's nothing to see in the land of the free. Father and mother, hear our plea. Father and mother, help us see how to lose a hatred and find your favor, how to break these cycles and change our nature, that we may walk underneath your banner in the land of the free. There's room for you and for me in the land of the free. In the land of the free. In the land of the free. The wisdom lesson today is from Yuval Noah Harari, who is a history professor at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. We are repeatedly told these days that we have entered the terrifying new era of post-truth, in which not just particular facts, but entire histories might be faked. But if this is the era of post-truth, when exactly was the halcyon age of truth? And what triggered our transition to the post-truth era? The internet? Social media? The rise of Putin and Trump? A cursory look at history reveals that propaganda and disinformation are nothing new. In fact, humans have always lived in the age of post-truth. Homo sapiens is a post-truth species who conquered this planet thanks above all to the unique human ability to create and spread fictions. We are the only mammals that can cooperate with numerous strangers because only we can invent fictional stories, spread them around, and convince millions of others to believe in them. As long as everybody believes in the same fictions, we all obey the same laws and can thereby cooperate effectively.
If you go to the bank tomorrow, or if you go to your post office box or to your mailbox, you may be surprised to find the bank closed and nothing in the mailbox because it's October 12th. It's a federal holiday for us, Columbus Day. In this part of the world, Columbus Day is not much more than an eminently forgettable federal holiday celebrating the landing of a 15th century seriously lost sailor landing on a Caribbean island that actually had millions of inhabitants on it. And in spite of that densely populated place, he had the temerity to go back to Spain and tell Queen Isabella that he had discovered it, which is roughly the equivalent of me claiming that I had discovered the Rocky Mountains after my first trip to Colorado. For the first 400 years after Columbus's first voyage to the Americas, not much was said about the allegedly Italian explorer sailing under the flag of Spain. In fact, Columbus was dusted off and represented to Americans in the early 19th century, or the late 19th century rather, after a tragic mass murder of Italian immigrants in New Orleans. 11 Italians were lynched when they went through a trial in which they were not convicted of having been part of a plot to murder the city's police chief. I'm sure you are aware that our current president's disdain for Mexican immigrants is of a cloth with the anti-immigrant sentiments in past centuries for the Chinese, the Irish, Germans, and Italian immigrants, all of whom usually came in waves from their nation when it was hard to get a job, it was hard to survive where they were, so they bought in to the greatness of opportunity in America and immigrated here. And like the Mexicans who risked life and limb to immigrate here, most of them were agricultural workers with little education and not a lot of English skills. To try to dilute this dangerous anti-Italian sentiment following this lynching in New Orleans, President Harrison in 1892 called for a one-time celebration of Columbus having discovered America. He was an Italian who made the very existence of the United States possible. This was both to quell tensions in America and, quite frankly, to calm down the Italian government that was none too happy about the way their Italians were being treated and portrayed in the United States. But the idea caught on in other places where there were large Italian populations. In Colorado, for example, there was an Italian newspaper, and that newspaper owner declared Columbus Day to be an event to be annually celebrated. The idea caught on and then eventually became a part of our regular calendar, but we find statues of Christopher Columbus in places where he never was. There's a statue in New York City, there's one in Washington, D.C., but Columbus actually only landed on islands in the Caribbean. He never actually found the United States mainland. But you'll find statues of them here and there, but even more interestingly, there are statues of Columbus all over Latin America because he is credited with having brought Spanish culture to those countries. But there's actually a statue of Columbus in Portugal because there is a strain of historical argument that Columbus was not Italian at all, but was in fact Portuguese, and that 100 years after he was dead, someone tried to polish his sailor credentials by making him an Italian. In fact, we have a listener in Portugal who, after a long conversation we had online the last time I brought Columbus up, I now understand that there are any number of people in Portugal who are willing to fight over the dubious honor of claiming Columbus as their own. The historical truth about Columbus is that he was an absolutely horrible human being. He was a cruel murderer, a greedy slave trader who also dabbled in capturing children to be sex slaves in Europe, all of which was to fatten his own estate. He was so greedy, in fact, he was removed from the government's role of governor in the Caribbean. All of you folks who buy a DNA test and are surprised to find that you have traces of Native American ancestry, yeah, that's not a happy story. Your ancestors brought that back to the Americas from Europe in their veins, and the way they got it is a very ugly narrative. Last month, President Trump gave a speech in which he was literally demanding that schools become propaganda centers, teaching the next generation to be more proud of being American by downplaying their knowledge of actual American history. He even specifically named the work of the famous American historian Howard Zinn as being an author who should be removed from school libraries and not discussed in classrooms. I don't know who wrote that speech for Donald Trump, but I'm willing to bet that he had no idea who Howard Zinn was. But someone put him in there. I'm confident that Trump's never read any of his books because it seems relatively apparent that he hasn't read any books at all. It was, however, my honor to meet and talk with Howard Zinn on 3 occasions, the first 2 times actually here in Springfield, once at Missouri State University, and then our School of Religion at Drury University had him come and speak there, and then later I got to have a longer visit with him when he was speaking at Harvard when I was a fellow there in 2004. He was a very amazing man, so insightful, and his ability to just strip away all the propaganda and myth from the stories that we've told ourselves about our history. It was just so amazing that when we started this church in 2008, our very first class was led by our own Dr. David Adams, who spent nearly a year guiding us through a study of Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, because I wanted our church to be started with a fierce orientation to our true history and the things that the cultural prejudices that we were inheriting. Trump doesn't really know much about history, and he cares even less. But he doesn't want you to know that Christopher Columbus was a murdering slave trader who got rich by abducting children for the sex trade. Still, the problem here is not just that Columbus was historically a bad guy. There are lots of bad guys in history, and there are a lot of dark chapters in our history of conquest, invasion, and frankly, pathological land theft on our way to declaring ourselves to be the greatest nation in the world. The problem is that Italians picked Columbus to be the central figure in a useful myth. Myths can be based on facts. A lot of times they're based on thin air, but myths have a function in society. They put a certain spin on history to give us self-confidence and pride and to justify our sense of privilege. In this sense, the Hebrew Bible is the perfect example of the use of myth as propaganda. The stories that were recorded by the Israelites who were captive in Babylon in the 5th century BC, describing their history from 5, 6, 7 years earlier as being a rather testy love story between their nation and God. Their story claims that they grew as a nation while they were slaves in Egypt, and that God delivered them from slavery and gave them their own land, a promised land. There is no persuasive reason to believe that any part of that myth is based on anything that happened in history. The Jews were one of many Palestinian tribes fighting for control of real estate that just happened to be located between 2 great continents where empires have been fighting since humans laid down their clubs and started to build walled cities. I never cease to be amused by evangelicals who have never noticed how ironic it is that the Jewish holy book, written by Jews, for Jews, is the book where they find the claim that God gave them this particular piece of real estate. What could be more convenient? I took an Israeli government subsidized trip to Jordan and Israel when I was in grad school. I was pretty out of place even then in a bus full of evangelical preachers, But I was excited to see what even I, at that tender young age, thought of as the Holy Land. But as we crossed the Jordan River and saw the impoverished refugee camps in the West Bank brimming with displaced Palestinians, our government guide shrugged off the obvious poverty and suffering of the camp and said to us, "They don't belong here. God gave this land to us." And the bus erupted in loud amens from all the preachers on the bus, and the tour guide had this wry grin on his face as he had obviously practiced that line and perfected playing American preachers like a fiddle. It was at that moment that I began to question the validity of what I had been told about the Promised Land. Folks, let me break it to you. God doesn't wear a gold jacket and doesn't work for Century 21. God no more parcels out land to one rival group over another than God prefers one football team or one baseball team over another. Apparently, I have it on good sources, that God is actually a ice hockey fan. Religious myths and national myths help to gloss over some of the sordid details of reality. We want to think of George Washington as a courageous military leader who helped American colonists to gain their freedom. We don't want to then dwell on the hundreds of slaves that he kept mercilessly captive on his farm, or those that he brought to Washington to serve in his household. While some myths just evolve in the self-congratulatory stew of society, many are intentionally created to promote and justify the abuses of the dominant culture. None other than Rudyard Kipling. I mean, I kind of hate to think that he turned his hand to this, but Rudyard Kipling wrote a famous poem titled "The White Man's Burden." And it was written to support our invasion of the Philippines, suggesting that white people in North America were obligated to carry blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans towards civilization, and that we were now obligated to do the same for Philippine natives, Muslims, and Asians. As if our enslavement of Africans, our genocide of Native Americans, and abusive labor practices towards Latinos was all a charitable education exercise on the part of white America. Did I tell you, by the way, that I discovered the Rocky Mountains? I mean, if you can sell one of these stories, you ought to be able to sell the other one. It's similar to the passionate support for America's manifest destiny that's portrayed in John Gass's late 19th century painting depicting the spirit of a sort of Italian-looking woman named Columbia flying through the air, Columbia obviously playing on Columbus, and she is guiding the westward movement of white people who beneath her are building railroads as she is stringing telegraph wire as they drove the Native Americans out of their way. She carries a textbook under her arm as if education was the hallmark of our conquest of lands that, you just have to admit, did not belong to us. The assumption was that our superior culture, our education, our agriculture, our technological advances justified the genocide and homicidal land theft we engaged in. But you know, folks, myths don't have to be bad. If myths play a role in defining a society or a given nation, what it wants to accomplish, if we tailor the myths to hold out to our nation a goal of who we want to be, then what we want to do is not necessarily just get rid of myths, but to find better myths. When I was a very little child, growing up in the deeply racist, segregated South, I would sit on Sunday mornings on little painted wooden chairs in the basement of the Glasgow, Kentucky First Christian Church, where I learned to sing that 19th century missionary song, Jesus loves the little children, all little children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. And as saccharine as the notion of a white Jesus holding little African and Asian kids on his lap, surrounded by complicit white kids, it probably was the most healthy message that I got about race in the first 20 years of my life. A lot better than God gave this land to us, or manifest destiny, or white man's burden kinds of myths, in spite of the fact that the whole red and yellow thing is pretty dated racially. If myths can be manufactured to hold out to society to define a better societal goal, why don't we create a noble myth for ourselves? One that doesn't rely on genocide or racism or exploitation or greed. And it doesn't have to be religious. And it really doesn't have to have anything to do with nationalism. It could be a myth about American virtue. I think we could even go back almost a whole century and grab it right out of the annals of American history to give it a good mythic ring. You know, it's always got to come from antiquity. But I'm thinking of a particular time in 1944 when we were still up to our eyebrows in World War II, and Franklin Roosevelt used his State of the Union address to try to plant a more noble vision in America's minds, other than simply defeating the Germans and the Japanese, so that we were fighting a great world war in order to become a greater people. Now, without rattling all the skeletons of Roosevelt's closet, and there are several, we could just take his words that described a nation on the other side of World War II. He said in that speech that America's Bill of Rights had offered political freedom to people, but had not really given them the opportunity to pursue happiness. Because happiness requires some security, some creature comfort, some real place in society. So Franklin proposed a second Bill of Rights that would be an economic Bill of Rights. He said that every American should be guaranteed a decent job with a living wage, and that farming should be fairly compensated, that health care, retirement, and education should be available to everyone. Now, he got a couple of those things. He certainly didn't get them all. But call me crazy, but what if we tried to polish our reputation as being the greatest nation on earth by actually becoming the greatest nation on earth? What if we created a civilization that succeeded in eradicating racism, that brought an end to poverty, that stopped engaging in war and in war on our planet and in class strife? We've done the impossible before. We harnessed electricity. We perfected the train. We invented automobiles and airplanes and computers and the internet. We went to the moon. We've developed vaccines that have wiped out plagues, that have murdered, killed millions upon millions of people. We did great things when history delivered us to the point where we could do those things. But now history has brought us to a point where we actually have the technology and the resources to end poverty. It could end with us. We could make education and healthcare available to everyone, and finally get to a point where we can be grown-ups and not sit on those little painted chairs anymore and accept that that whole red and yellow, black and white was much ado about melanin. We can just let it go. I'm willing to sign on to the myth of America's greatness. I just think it's a future goal rather than a past state of inequality to be recovered. And the great thing about this myth is it shouldn't take very much to convince you to buy into it. Because if you just check your own hearts, you already know that it's true. Amen. Thanks.
This is Light a Candle by Neil Young. Instead of cursing in the darkness, light a candle for where you're going. There's something ahead worth fighting for. When the light of time is on us, you will see our moment come, and the living soul inside will carry on. It's a chance to give new meaning to every move we make, in the cavern, in the cave, where we come from. When the light of dawn is on us, we will see what we can be, and the ancient ones will sleep, the ancient sleep. In the hallways of the ages, on the road to history, what we do now will always be on with us. Well, it's a chance to give new meaning to every move we make, in the caverns, in the caves, where we've gone wrong. Instead of cursing in the darkness, light a candle for where you're going. There's something ahead worth looking for. When that light of time is on us, and see our moment come, and the living soul inside will carry on. Light a candle in the darkness, so others might see ahead. Light a candle in the darkness when you go. Instead of cursing in the darkness, light a candle where you're going. There's something ahead worth looking for. When the light of time is on us, we'll see our moment come, and the living soul inside will carry on.
Let me encourage you now to go now in peace, to love and to serve one another. You will only see the face of God if you are able to see it in your brothers and sisters who are in need, especially in the midst of this pandemic. Care for the sick. Be attentive to those that you haven't seen or heard from. Stay home as much as you can. Wear a mask every time you leave the house. Wash your hands, for goodness sakes, and keep your distance from others. We're going to get through this if we take care of each other. Peace be with you.